DePen. Why is this a better model? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages, Alex?
So at the high level, I think it's about creating competition. Whenever a market is dominated by one large or two, three large players, it ends up causing problems. It ends up potentially inhibiting innovation, potentially harming consumers. So what's initially just cool about this is like an Airbnb, Uber type model, right? Except you're providing it in a decentralized setting where there's not necessarily one owner or one central point of failure. So in the decentralized storage world, you can crowdsource storage from around the world at a much lower cost than would take to otherwise set up a cloud company. If you can rally a community around the globe around a cause, then you can actually onboard more hardware in more points of presence than potentially even a large cloud computing company.
Hey everyone, I've got a super fun episode ahead of us. I'm with Alex Mirran from Lilypad. Alex and I met actually through your dad, Alex. Isn't that right?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story, right? I think there's a couple of things here that I love to talk about. One is like crypto is full of people that are really high performers and have done a lot of cool stuff already. And sometimes, and I think this happens, me being a VC, I'm used to this, but in tech investing, right? People can kind of be like, oh, he's too young to really know what he's doing. But Alex and I got together and we jammed, and I was super impressed. The way that we got together and jammed is you have a very proud dad, and your dad, Alex, was basically like, my son's awesome in crypto. And of course, I was hoping you would be, but we've all had those conversations where someone's like, oh yeah, this person's really, knowledgeable in crypto, and they're not. And so we got together and I immediately was like, okay, Alex really knows his stuff. You're working on some really interesting things that we're going to get down into the rabbit hole. And so maybe introduce yourself, talk about your crypto journey, and then talk about what you're doing over at Lilypad.
Yeah, for sure. And it also feels like, you can sort of be young in the industry and still have something to bring to the table if you're willing to work very hard. You're willing to put in those weekends. You're willing to hang out with people like yourself and absorb information as quickly as possible and keep moving. So that's what I've just noticed. That's what the best do. So I try to emulate that, right? But yeah, my background is in finance and computer science. Worked in a bunch of traditional finance companies like John Hancock, and then in some findechs, and then really was attracted to the Web3 space initially because of Bitcoin and the value proposition brought to the table from Bitcoin, and then of course fell down the rabbit hole as you also have into smart contracts and into DePin networks, so decentralized physical infrastructure networks, building out cloud-based services using blockchain technology. And so, yeah, co-founded a software as a service company, and I'm now head of business development over at Lilypad Network.
Yeah, I don't think people, I talk about DePin a lot. I think it's one of the most exciting places to be. We love investing in like DePin projects, especially ones that we think are adding a lot of value. Let's talk about DePin at an ultra high level, Alex. And I love that you have this background with Filecoin. We can talk about what Filecoin is and what drew you to that project, because I think it's really like one of the first examples of DePin that existed even before the term DePin became a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. It's, we have these traditional services, like, for example, cloud storage, like you mentioned, that you can bring additional benefits and value using, emerging technologies. So in this case, using peer-to-peer networking, using cryptographic verification of, has the data been stored, or is the data available, or has the compute been run, whatever that is. And it brings additional value propositions and even new use cases to, just traditional markets, traditional industries that people do. In this case, cloud storage. But there's some incredible projects out there that are working on lots of interesting stuff, like providing compute, providing storage. There's a really cool project called WeatherXM. Not a bag I have, but it's really interesting. They're doing decentralized weather stations, and so a mesh network of weather stations across the world that has an incentive to set up and provide that data back to the network. And WeatherXM themselves didn't have to raise a tremendous amount of money to buy that hardware, deploy that hardware, manage the hardware. They just use a crypto economic mechanism to incentivize the community and peer-to-peer networking to orchestrate the whole thing.
Totally. Like let's boil it. Like let's go high level, right? Like I think of DePin as the sharing economy 2.0, right? And what I mean by that is, and I think the easiest example that everyone understands is, we can think back to a world where it was just taxis. Like if you want to get a ride somewhere, you call a taxi company, and it's a company, right? And you're just dealing with employees of that company. And then Uber came along, right? And basically was like, okay, everybody has these resources that they're not using full time. The drivers that want to utilize those resources to make additional money or to have, an economic incentive, essentially, we're going to allow those people to utilize those cars when they're not, when they normally wouldn't be utilizing it. So basically utilizing an asset to get extra earning power. And, let's take that analogy and let's just focus at first, because dependent has lots of applications, just like sharing economy, has Airbnb. I've seen startups along the way in the Web2 sector that's even like, do you want to use the tools out of your neighbor's shed? It's kind of like this overall concept of having an asset and utilizing it in a way that you wouldn't utilize before. But let's talk about, just to keep the audience slowly dipping in the pool of DeepHand world, let's talk about storage, right? And this is one of the really first use cases, as I mentioned. Let's talk about like Amazon as it exists today, right? Which would be sort of the taxi companies in this analogy. And then let's talk about, Filecoin and all these other storage-focused Web3 solutions. And why is this a better model? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages, Alex?
Yeah. The biggest decentralized storage networks now are probably Filecoin, Arweave. I think Sia and MaidSafe also have some market share storage. It's really, so at the high level, I think it's about creating competition, right? So whenever a market is dominated by one large or two, three large players, it ends up causing problems. It ends up, potentially inhibiting innovation, potentially harming consumers. So what's initially just cool about this is, like you said, it's like an Airbnb, Uber type model, right? Except you're providing it in a decentralized setting where there is not necessarily one owner, one central point of failure. So in the decentralized storage world, what's interesting is that you can crowdsource storage from around the world at a much lower cost than it would take to otherwise set up a cloud company and provide competition to the largest cloud compute providers. Now, Amazon and all these big guys, of course, can outspend. They have large networks, and they also have distributed computing. So they have data centers all over the place. And so the question then becomes, okay, why would I choose Filecoin or Arweave over an AWS? And right now, what we're seeing, the main use cases are around verifiability of data. So primarily, like when you save data on Amazon, there's no cryptographic guarantee. There's no verifiability in terms of that data being stored, for how long it's being stored. Of course, you may be able to sign an SLA with them. You may have some abilities to do stuff like that that are legally binding. But apart from that, as a normal developer, there aren't too many guarantees. The other thing that's interesting is the data itself that's saved on Filecoin is hashed. So essentially what that means is the file has a cryptographic identifier that is determined or derived from the binary of the file. So every file in the world, on the internet, has a binary, right? Ones and zeros. And so those ones and zeros are saved in that cryptographic identifier. And even if one of those binary digits changes, a new identifier is created. So I'm referring to something called IPFS, which is a part of the Filecoin stack, which provides verifiability of data, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot of very important use cases that require verifiability of data. And so these types of networks are working on, how do we commercialize this? And how do we actually provide a solution that end users can use? And then there's a whole ecosystem of companies that built around that implement the tech. And I think what we're seeing right now is they build, Filecoin is a pretty general purpose thing. But what we're seeing now is companies all around, ancillary companies, are building for specific customers and specific use cases. And so, like any other startup, like any other, business setting, you have to have customers, you have to have revenues, and you have to provide a service that solves someone's problem. And so that's really cool. Some of the downsides that those companies are kind of abstracting away and trying to deal with is, for one thing, using a blockchain can be time. I guess it could take time to save data. It could be costly to save data. So there's different mechanisms to do, like scaling up the number of transactions per second that these systems can do. There's really great user interfaces that are built on top. These things are not easy to use. It's not. As an individual, you're not just going to you can't really just go to you can, but it's very difficult to go to the Filecoin network and just say, hey, store some data. It's not like a Google Drive. And so there's companies like DDocs, which is really cool, from Fileverse, I believe. They're building, a decentralized Google Drive, providing the value propositions of, we're giving you proofs that the data is being stored. We're giving you cryptographically hashed data. And in the long run, the vision for a lot of these compute networks is to actually have more points of presence than a traditional cloud company. So you may not be able to outspend a cloud company, but if you can rally a community around the globe around a cause, then you can actually onboard more hardware in more points of presence than potentially even a large cloud computing company. And so we're not quite there yet. Like I would say we're getting there. It's part of the vision. But at the end of the day, I mean, you're in venture capital, right? It's like safer, faster, cheaper. That's what we're looking for, right? And so if we're laying the groundwork for that, and then it's going to take companies sort of abstracting away the complexity. You need like, for example, you probably want an SLA. If you're an enterprise and you're saving data on some system, you want an SLA, you want encryption, and you probably don't want the data to be public. And that's another one of the pieces of the puzzle here that is a little tricky because, as we all know, like the Bitcoin blockchain, for example, is a public ledger. That's kind of the point of a blockchain, right? And so Filecoin is no different, right? You have a public ledger of proofs of the data being saved. And, some enterprises, or most enterprises, are not really cool with that the data, even if it's encrypted, if it's even retrievable, like they're not really cool with that. And so, again, startups, it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to build businesses and interfaces on top of that for specific users. And so it's really exciting to see tons of companies that we're familiar with and that we're working with that are building those use cases out, including what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, look, like any internet company is inhibited by the greater system, right? So, bandwidth in general has, the improvement of bandwidth over time, and it did take time. I mean, I remember when downloaded video was like, okay, 3 hours, right? Just sort of set it and forget it. Or like when Napster first came out, you want to download an album, right? It could take an hour. And now it's instantaneous. But all these different solutions, all these different protocols or applications they're kind of like handcuffed by the greater system. So there's all these things going on to improve. I mean, even when Amazon Cloud like emerged, right? It was like way slower, I'm sure, in some ways than having, a hard drive in your computer. But eventually over time, the system upgraded and then the application was able to get stronger and stronger. And in venture capital, you see this a lot where there's this push and pull where, you are limited when you're talking about internet or most technology solutions are internet driven in a lot of different ways, or at least software solutions. There's more and more use cases that come online as the greater system improves. And so you have projects working on improving the overall greater system, which is infrastructure. And then you have new use cases that get even stronger and stronger as that greater system emerges. And then there's even new applications. And I think it's the same, obviously, in Web3, where you have all these different applications, and some of them may be slower or less efficient now, that you have to believe that as the system gets better, eventually it will be a better system. And for blockchain, I think it's always centered around, as you mentioned, security, the ability to prove that data is not corrupt. I think, especially as AI gets more prolific and more sophisticated, everyone's kind of aware that it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not real, even in videos now, right? Like forget documentation. And so it's more and more important to encourage a system that may feel like a step back or two at first, but then as a giant leap forward as the infrastructure evolves.
Totally. And that's honestly what attracted myself and the team that I work with to the cloud services part of the blockchain world, right? Because there's a lot of financial use cases, right? My business partner came from Amazon Web Services, and something he likes to talk about that every cloud company and really every internet computer user faces is a physics phenomenon called the speed of light, right? You can't go faster really than the speed of light. Maybe one day we can. Right now we can't. And so we use fiber optic cables to move that data, right? And so if data is being stored in San Francisco and you're calling that data in Indonesia, there's latency, and there's a fundamental sort of limit to how fast that data can move. And so what traditional web hosting companies do, Amazon, Cloudflare, they just cache the data. They just say, oh, okay, you want to be able to serve customers in Indonesia? Well, we're going to have your data in a data center in Singapore that's just really close to Indonesia or whatever, right? And so that's something that is just what cloud businesses are doing in general. And so if you now map that to like these Web3 DePIN protocols, oh, wow, like we could have decentralized caching. We can have decentralized compute at the edge as close as possible to the user with a cryptographic guarantee that the data is being saved, that the compute happened. And so, yeah, to your point, like it might be a few more hoops to jump through today, but in the long run, we're dealing with the speed of light here. And so whatever we can do to address that is takes us fundamentally further in terms of what the applications that we can build, the systems we can build, and the cost of doing so, it ends up getting reduced.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like now maybe it's a lot slower, but of course, like if now you're, when you talk about edge computing, if the network gets to such a um, concentration or population that your neighbor or somebody in your building, right, you're calling data from them essentially because everybody's participating in this decentralized storage. Because why not? My computer isn't using all those resources all the time, and why not make a little bit of money? Or whatever my incentives are. Now you solve that problem. So once again, few steps backwards, one big leap forward. And I think like that is the heart of most like investing when it comes to Web3 in general, is you have to believe that ultimately the better system will emerge, and you have to be willing to go through kind of the growing pains of the system being lesser or more frustrating, especially when you talk about like user interface, right? And I mean, crypto is still very like, if you get off the exchanges, it feels very cyberpunkish, right? It's kind of a crazy experience. Like you're plugging in a hard device to your computer, you're pushing buttons like you're arming a nuclear warhead, and you're moving money around, and like you're getting hashes and transactions, and it's kind of a crazy thing when you take a step back. But eventually all that is going to be abstracted away, and it'll be a much better system.
Yeah.
So let's talk about other uses of DPEN. Me and you have jammed a lot on like GPU usage, and I know that's what you guys are kind of touching over at Lilypad. And so I want to talk about this from a high concept. I've talked about this in a few of my short videos, and Mike the Crypto Guy, and the different social medias I have, and I've interviewed a lot of founders that are working on GPU solutions. But let's talk about like why this is a no-brainer in the sense of who's competing in the market to provide GPUs. There's a limited supply. There's increasing demand, and so I think this is one of those use cases that's very obvious because the solution is going to be like an absolute necessity for alternatives.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Lilypad Network is a distributed computing platform, mostly used for like running AI models at the edge. There's some different companies, different teams building out sort of different versions of the GPU, sort of these cloud-hosted GPU, distributed compute network. Some are focused on let's just get people they're mostly all focused on aggregating idle compute capacity. So that's one thing that's really exciting about this is we all have phones in our pockets. We all have these really powerful laptops. We all produce data. And so taking a step back in terms of like why DPIN is really exciting for the future, we could potentially, or actually it's happening now, is monetize that compute, right? There's some startups, and I know you're familiar with some that you work with directly that are helping monetize your data. And so it's almost like a world of, I don't want to call it like a universal basic income thing, but it's like it's a non-government, it's a private sector version of, potentially everyone in the world having a way to make some sort of side money on the side. And so, for Lilypad and for the GPU networks, gamers and developers and businesses all have GPUs. They use them, and then they just sit there. I think I saw a study from Dell. We were talking with them, and they were saying their high performance computing clusters are only utilized about 40% of the time, I believe.
Right. And this is just real quick. This is why I love the sharing economy analogy, because it was like the same statistics with cars, right? It was like you use your car 5% of the day, right? Or something. There's like some stats on that. And it's basically this asset that's just sitting there, not being utilized, but everybody needs to utilize it at some point.
Oh yeah. Oh, now you're talking about robo-taxis from Tesla and others. That's exciting.
Well, right. I actually think that's what GPUs is kind of like, which is like, you don't actively have to do anything, right? It just sits there and goes off and earns money on its own through the structured solutions. And you just sit there and earn extra income, like you were saying.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm seeing people kind of take it upon themselves to become their own little cloud computing company. So just like people will buy up, 5 Airbnbs and they become a mini, hotel service almost, people are running a Filecoin storage miner. They're running a Lilypad GPU compute miner.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So they're running these different networks, they're running a bunch of them. And then it's like their side hustle, and it turns into almost like a decentralized computing business that they generate income from on a monthly basis. some you make more money than others, but at the end of the day, you still need customers, right? And so some of the networks will get the customer demand for you, and they just push it to your machine. And then others like Filecoin, you kind of need to go out and you either work with the sort of the foundation of Filecoin or Filecoin Foundation, or you go out and get your own customers. Anyway, so yeah, it's really cool to see. It's obviously pretty new, but just like Uber and Airbnb, when they came around to challenge the existing order, it definitely took some time, because we're also, Uber changed consumer behavior, right? Like growing up, I was told, don't even mention to anybody where you are, and don't ever get into a stranger's car. And then fast forward today, is I hit a button and I say, here's where I am, I'm going to get you in your car, right? And so
Yeah.
that's one of the things that's cool about blockchain is like so one of the problems that like these edge computing, all enterprises, all large cloud companies, they all have like content delivery networks, these like edge networks, like I was talking about before. It's very expensive to set up. You have to maintain it and everything. And so that's what like networks like Lilypad and these other GPU compute networks are providing, cryptographic guarantees that the compute happened. And so now you can utilize this like crazy edge network, and in the long run, it'll be safer, faster, cheaper. And so we're changing consumer expectations a little bit. Enterprise is definitely like much slower to adopt, which is totally reasonable. And companies are going to figure out the right way to abstract away certain things. Private networks are also a thing, right? Enterprises will just run their own private like blockchain or their own private distributed ledger. And so, yeah, it's been pretty cool to see it unfold. But at the end of the day, when there's a problem and an inefficiency, this, it's an opportunity, right? It's a business opportunity to either adapt an existing business, build a new one, build out some functionality. So that's what at Lilypad, that's what we're doing, is we're talking to developers, we're talking to machine learning researchers and labs, and then large enterprises, and saying that these are the value propositions we can bring. These are some of the trade-offs. And, here's how we're building the interface to abstract away a lot of the problems.
Yeah, I think, look, and we didn't even touch on AI, right? So like AI is this exponential, like to use the pun, machine, right? It's just going to consume so much GPU power in the future. And, NVIDIA, AMD, a lot of these companies from a production perspective, they're tapped out. So like if you're a company that decides that it needs to get competitive in AI, that's going to require compute power via GPUs, right? And if you can't get more units, and like, how are you going to solve that problem? Well, there's a bunch of unutilized units out there. So it's sort of like if all the car makers in the world, to use our car analogy, suddenly said, we can't make any more cars. There's no cars available. You can go to a car dealership and you can put in a year or two wait. And it's like, well, wait, like we utilize cars in our business. Like we need fleet vehicles. We need to basically transport things. This is how we conduct business. Well, obviously the solution would be go look at cars that already exist, that are out there, that aren't being utilized, and see if you can purchase or rent or lease or whatever the agreement is, some of those. And that's really what's happening with the GPU solutions, because there are centralized GPU solutions, just like Amazon Cloud, right, offers compute or not compute, but storage capacity. And yes, I think like the decentralization also brings some long tail things that people are getting more comfortable with, and they're making them higher priority, right? This like uncorruptibility of data, this, all the things that we talked about. But the immediate need for GPU is like, even if you don't believe in any of that stuff or that it's important, you're going to need more GPU compute power. And I think every company, that's going to be the case over the next 5 years.
Definitely. And that's part of the bet we're making. The other thing we're noticing is definitely like an accumulation of compute power towards the top, right? So even at Lilypad, we have like a Google Cloud instance that we use as like part of our development environment, and it has a bunch of GPUs. And a lot of the times, I don't know, probably 60 to 70% of the time, we'll spin that thing up and it'll say, sorry, compute resources are not available.
Oh, interesting. Okay. You're already experiencing that when you just want to do like testing.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I'm sure, like, if we paid more, if we were a bigger customer, then that probably wouldn't happen, right? So I don't want to sit here and say, like, oh, they just have no GPUs. Like, they do, and there's plenty of providers, like you said, that are not what Amazon, that are small, that you can rent GPUs from. So yeah, it's like it's definitely sort of a market that feels like the largest companies that can afford to buy the GPUs have them, and then the largest companies that can afford to pay for them get that access. And so that's one thing we're excited about with Lilypad and DPINs in general, is democratizing access to low cost, high performance, compute. And so just like Amazon and cloud services kind of unlocked sort of like a revolution of development and in terms of how modern software development gets done. And then companies like Airbnb and Uber showed up and they're just software platforms, right? That was enabled by cloud hosting services. And so we do see a sort of a new opportunity of like, well, you unlock GPUs for the masses, you unlock compute at a very low level. And wow, like now you can sort of enable more applications, enable more things. And also, like, you don't want to compete on cost, right? Because AWS, their revenue run rate is what, 110 billion a year or something like that. Like, you're not going to really win on cost, but there's a lot of value add propositions that you can provide. And you mentioned AI, so Lilypad is like very focused on serving ML researchers, labs running ML for, like, for example, BioML is like a huge use case and a huge customer that we have in our pipeline that really needs compute. I think there's a funny saying. It's like Stanford has more PhDs than they do GPUs. I think they have like 60 GPUs, something like that, which is really nothing for an entity like that. And so anyway, but applying some of these cool new tools like blockchain verification, hashing data, so you have content address data, that is fundamentally important for AI. Because, and I'll preface by saying I'm not an AI expert. But what I would say is that when you have a model and you have training data and you have inputs and outputs, there's a big incentive and a big reason for that data to be verifiable.
Sure.
Whether you're an enterprise or an individual, you might be an enterprise creating some kind of agent. You might be a consumer who's talking to like an AI girlfriend, whatever it is. Like these things, you said earlier, these AI powered systems are proliferating across our lives. And so part of our fundamental bet, and I know Filecoin and a lot of other compute networks are sort of gearing towards this, is providing verifiable data. So train the model. We're not doing training data, but there's others that are doing training data. And then we do verifiable inputs and outputs. Sometimes those outputs are used, in other models. So like stringing together models in like a workflow. And then of course, a verification that the compute happened. That's the other thing, is if you have an AI system, there's a whole sort of movement of the open source AI world, right? So it's like there's kind of the closed source AI world of the open AIs and those guys, and then the open source AI world of people who, like, they don't want to use big cloud providers. They're building applications that maybe are sensitive for consumers, or sometimes it's a philosophical thing, like Bitcoin. People really just care about creating an alternative system, and so they need mechanisms like this to actually facilitate those use cases. And so it's the market's there, but I think what every VC likes to hear is that it's growing, and it's a fraction of the size of what it will be in terms of the need for not just to compute, but actually the verifiability of the whole flow.
Well, it's a massively expanding market, and this solution is taking away, it's chipping away at market share of the existing market. So you kind of have a double whammy, if you will. And look, maybe my new line is going to be, I'm not an expert in AI, but my AI is. Maybe that'll be my new moving forward. But to that point, so let's talk about when somebody discovers Lilypad, like one of your customers, right? You mentioned you guys have a handful of, especially like niche customers that you work with. What do they say when they're like, wow, this is amazing because X, Y, and Z? What is that X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest exciting use cases for AI and ML in general is BioML. And so that's why we've very much tailored a lot of what we're doing right now to serving those types of customers. And those users don't really care about Web3 or blockchain, right? They don't want to set up a MetaMask wallet, a crypto wallet, and go get some tokens and, interact with the chain. They just need a service that works. And they need it low cost. They need it to be available all the time. They need high performance. And then they hear about these added levels of functionality, like verifiable data and verification that compute happened. We're also talking, so Lilypad has what we're calling a module marketplace. So when you run a job on the Lilypad network, it's a serverless inference network. So it's like you don't rent a GPU for a day, you pay per compute job. And so in that module marketplace, you can choose modules that other people have built and run it on the network. And because the data is verified, because we know, okay, this module came from this individual, we're creating the payment rails to where you can have attribution. So the person who created the model can actually get a piece of the fee because they're the one who actually said, hey, I'm going to take this AI model, I'm going to configure it to run on Lilypad. It's just a Docker image. And then they put it up in the module marketplace. And then, so for example, we have a BioML researcher, right? She's prolific, pushing the industry forward. Half the industry uses her models either directly or as a derivative. And so we're talking to her about, hey, well, what if, we have our platform in the middle of all this? So we have the compute over here, but then over here, we have the attribution for the actual IP that you're creating. So that's the other level that's really interesting is once you have that foundation of truth, okay, this data is original, it's authentic, and we know exactly where it came from. Of course, if you want that, if you want to be private, that's fine too. Then we can provide attribution in the form of a crypto token. So, the Lilypad's going to launch a token that you use to pay for compute jobs. These people who create modules can get paid also for their work. And then to be able to run a node, and this is very common for most deep in networks, you have to collateralize is the wrong word, but you have to basically take some tokens, put it in a contract, and that contract locks the money to where if you misbehave, so if you don't fulfill your agreement, if you're providing improper results, if you just turn your machine off, you will lose that money. And so it's all about game theory. Like blockchains are all about game theory. And so there's a disincentive there to misbehave. And so that ends up creating inherent demand for the token as the economy grows. Filecoin does that. Tons of other networks do that.
Yeah. I mean, and this is just to go a little higher level too. This is the concept of utility, right? Which is the main thesis of driving value for a token. A lot of people look at the token markets and they think, why does this thing go up or down in price? And of course, a lot of that is retail driven. It's an open market. Anybody can buy or sell, or most people can buy and sell at any given time. Like, the public can react to false news. They can react to real news. Like the day-to-day movement is not fundamental, but over time, if there's a reason that people should buy and hold your token, and I think what you're mentioning is a lot of projects have taken this idea of utility, which is in order to utilize our services, you have to pay in our token, right? So you have to pay in our currency, basically, right? If you want to, the analogy would be, oh, we're a country that makes the best steel parts in the world, and if you want to buy our steel parts, we only accept our currency for it, right? And that drives up utility. And then what you're also talking about is game theory, which is how do you de-incentivize people to be bad actors? And it's all economically driven, right? Which is I'm going to put my money in basically an escrow, and the guarantee of the escrow is that I'm going to act within the parameters of our agreement. And if I don't, I lose the money. And so why would I do something as crazy? Like a rational person would not choose to basically do something that would be de-incentivizing. We do this every day. I mean, not to this isn't a car commercial, but when we go to rent cars, right, there's like a deposit. When we go to a hotel room, they're like, we're going to put a hold on your account for X amount of money. You get it back, if you don't destroy the hotel room. And so this is like a very common concept. I think we're just not used to it being ingrained in the actual value of the thing that we're providing as well.
Totally. And that's why some people will say, well, why do you need a token? Like, why are you just making money out of thin air? And it's for that exact reason, is because you need to have a mechanism that can go cross borders, that can be used to incentivize things, disincentivize things, provide sort of a level playing field for everybody, and basically make the whole economy function. This is an economy that we've created, and it's not just based in one country. And so you need to be able to do that cross-border and instantaneously. And so you couldn't do this with the SWIFT banking system of the US, of the world, right? It would be virtually impossible, I think. I mean, I think people have tried probably. But anyway, and then what we'll do is for users who don't want to deal with crypto, we just abstract that away with our SaaS product. So you pay with your credit card, and under the hood, you're using Lilypad tokens. But I think that's a pretty common kind of crypto thing.
So how does that work? Do you guys just set everything up for them and then manage the account? How does that actually work?
Yeah, so our SaaS product is very much in beta right now, but it's like any other cloud hosting provider, right? So let's just say you're a machine learning researcher, and you're like, I'm doing rare disease research. I need to discover a new drug, and I need to use these 3 models. So you come to the Lilypad software product. I believe this will probably launch early or late Q1 of next year. And you say, okay, I'm going to use these models. You can create a workflow, even you can string models together, and you just put a credit card in like any other cloud platform. I'm sure we'll have an option to where you can connect a crypto wallet and go buy our token, but we'll just abstract that away with like Stripe or some kind of payment mechanism, or stable coins. People are interested in, stable coins are a cryptocurrency that's pegged 1-to-1 to the dollar. So sometimes people would rather pay with a stable coin. But yeah, what's so interesting I think about all this is there's actually, you said it, utility. Like it's called a utility token. Filecoin is a utility token. Render is a utility token. Like these are tokens that are used to incentivize some kind of behavior and really bootstrap an economy out of thin air.
Right. Yeah. 100%. And so like, I just want to pull on that string a little bit just because I'm curious. So like, because I think this is a big concept in crypto, right? You have crypto native people that are willing to go through all the hoops and all the education to like set up their wallets and keep their assets safe in exchange for different tokens. And I mean, there's a ton of transactions involved with each of these. And unfortunately, the system, the way that it works is like, in order for it to be like completely freedom granting from how you spend your money, consequences are also on you, right? So like every time you have to do an action in the decentralized world, it's a vector for a mistake that can cost you hypothetically all your money, right? That you're moving around. And so it doesn't surprise me that you have a lot of, researchers, especially that they're not technically savvy and they haven't gone through it. And like, why would I want to be responsible for sending this money and setting this all up? But then what happens if I screw up, right? Like, does that come out of my paycheck? All that. So you guys take the payment from them, but you still have to work within the mechanisms that you guys have set up within the protocol. So how do you, and if it's too early, let me know, but how are you guys tackling that in the sense of, are you like creating wallets for them and using that? Like, how does that all work? I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the details of that are probably still being finalized, but my understanding, our plan is to, you basically create a wallet under the hood. There's some really cool services that I don't know which one we're probably going to use, but there's a bunch of services that will allow you to log in with like an email and then, or sorry, like you build an app, right? And you integrate this service. And what the service does is a user logs in with their email and a crypto wallet is automatically generated on the back end. Then the user may or may not even know. Depends on if the developer wants them to know. And so yeah, that's what we're going to do. I'm sure is we basically will have that kind of account abstraction, as it's called. A wallet gets spun up behind. You swipe your credit card, that will populate tokens from our network directly into that wallet. And then as you're spending, just like if you're using like the ChatGPT API, right? You've got credits up there, right? A little top right corner, it says how many credits you have left, how many times you can call the API. So same thing, right? It'll be sort of like probably like a credit-based system if I had to guess. And then for larger companies, I think we're looking at like service contracts, like SLAs. And so that's another layer of abstraction. Is like, okay, like these guys don't even want to, they don't want to deal with any of this, right? And so we can just have a wallet created, tokens propagated into the wallet, and then when the job gets called, that wallet just gets billed.
Right, the white glove approach, if you will.
100%. And I think that's like there are crypto users to tailor to, and we're really excited. Like you can run an AI job with a smart contract. So that's like a huge deal for Web3 inclined people who care about like user self-sovereignty and not having control from the big corporate overlords. But for most general enterprise users and for researchers and for even developers who aren't in the blockchain world, like they just want something that works. And so it's a pretty pragmatic thought process, and I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, like it's I've done like work, independently with large organizations, and when they're like, we want to look at blockchain solutions. First of all, they generally it's like a broad interest level, and they want to kind of understand what's out there, and they're probably getting presented with solutions, but they don't know how to like assess them, right? Both in how they would solve their problems, because I think crypto is terrible at saying, you have this problem, you've wanted solved, we're going to solve it for you. Don't worry about the technology, we'll solve it. I think crypto's probably the worst industry I've ever seen in my life at that. And that's like a separate, we don't need to go down a rabbit hole on that. But then, when you start asking basic questions like, oh, okay, so are you going to set up, your own wallets? And yes, I guess so. And, are you're going to buy like, let's say, Ethereum or whatever, because you want to do some on-chain transactions, who's going to have access to all that, right? Like, oh, we haven't thought about that. Like who's going to make decisions within the organization strategically of, where you guys should participate in the blockchain world. Well, our executives don't even know enough about crypto to even make those strategic decisions. And now you run into like this issue where you just get analysis paralysis. I do think companies are realizing, especially in the financial sector and other sectors like, that you guys target, where they need to explore alternatives. There's this chicken and egg problem where it's like, okay, do we just abstract away everything? And that solves maybe the pain point, and maybe for some companies that works, but then they have no control. And there's other companies that say, well, no, we want control, like we want to own this. But then it's like, okay, but where do we even start with getting, solving the problems of like who has access, who's going to make the decisions, who's going to actually do the transactions, like who's going to decide where you go strategically, all these different things. And I have to imagine that when you guys are talking to customers, you've probably had all these kinds of conversations where there's different sophistication levels from customers, and there's different, like, they probably, I would imagine, they more gravitate towards the white glove solution, which is, can you just do it? We just want the end solution. We don't care how we get there.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends on who you're building for, like any other startup, right? So if you're building for, a Web3 inclined audience who cares about, like, the most hardcore Bitcoin people care about having a financial system outside of the traditional banking and traditional financial system, right? That's a very like philosophical decision to make that then gets implemented in code, which is kind of wild to think about, right? Like most individuals, they're not as worried about, being resistant to like a nation state attack like Bitcoin is. And so, yeah, it really just depends on the use case. And I think, a lot of blockchain teams kind of try to be everything for everyone.
They're nothing for anyone, I mean, is the problem, right?
I think it's the typical startup approach where, because I think you and I talked about this, right? Pretty much every crypto you've ever heard of outside of Bitcoin can be considered a startup, even if they're big, even if they have traction. Like these are startups that are trying to.
I mean, I even consider Bitcoin a startup, right? Like just a late stage one, right? Like
I would probably agree with that, yeah. And so I think like even Uber, when they launched, they didn't have Uber Eats, they didn't have Uber Chopper, they didn't have all these other ancillary services. So I think what's really interesting about, like, you've been in the software industry for probably even a lot longer than I have, it's implement quickly, build, learn, create tight feedback loops with your on the ground market, and then iterate. And so I think, like, if you look at the best teams just in the traditional web, like if you look at the web in the 90s, which we're kind of, for the blockchain crypto where we're kind of like, I don't know, what do you think, 1998 or something like that?
I mean, yeah, something like, I mean, so back there, right? Like we're still in like dial-up modems and things like that,
Yeah. So I mean, when you look at like those types of things, you have a couple teams like Amazon that kind of was the everything for everyone that did really well. Most it kind of pivoted to, they entered the market, they learned, create tight feedback loops, and then they built the code to then implement like those learnings. And those are the teams that were successful, that survived, and that are, some of them are $100 billion companies today. So blockchain world isn't anything different, right? You have to build, and ideally you have a strong team to where not only do you have a pulse of the market, but you also can implement what you learn really quickly. And that's not easy to do. Especially when you're dealing with like public blockchains, right? And so yeah, Lilypad is like not a blockchain, not a public blockchain itself. We were built on top of the Ethereum blockchain, actually on top of Arbitrum, which is a layer 2 on top of Ethereum. And so we have some flexibility. We built it in a very modular way to where, like, the data storage could be AWS, could be Filecoin, it could be your own computer if you want. You build these things in a way that's modular so that you're not locked into any one specific thing.
Yeah, let's talk about this. The not to interrupt, but modular is, it's something that's thrown around a lot, and I don't think people really understand it. I think this happens a lot in technology where you have new terms emerge and you get people that know how to use them in a sentence roughly correctly a lot more than people that really understand them. And I think, look, that's it. Look, crypto, early technology investing, it's full of imposter syndrome because you're constantly learning and you feel like everyone's smarter than you, and you hear a word and you're like, I really don't know what that word is, but I'm going to like kind of listen to how they use it. So let's help everyone out. Let's talk about modularity as you define it and why why that's such an advantage in the way that you guys built your solution.
Yeah, I mean it's like Legos, right? You can just kind of plug in different pieces. You can follow the directions for a specific Lego box, or you can build your own shit, right? You can build your own stuff, and so with your own imagination. And so it's the same thing with software. So software is interesting. When you build a TV, no, your boss isn't going to come to you and say, "Okay, now I want that TV to be a microwave." Also, but in software, you'll build something, and then they're like, "Okay, now we want it to do this other thing," and so you kind of have to be careful with how you build these things, because if you make all these decisions ahead of time, then you can't make those changes later down the line. So for Lilypad specifically, I use the term modular in the sense of we have this compute network that you can run these jobs on. But if you want to save the data on your machine, if you want to save the data on Filecoin, if you want to save the data on Amazon, you can make that choice. And right now, it's pretty you kind of have to be pretty technically inclined to be able to make that choice and actually implement it. But as we build out our software product and as the network matures, that will change and we'll make it a lot easier. But the idea is that it's like Legos. You can just plug in different things. So another great example is privacy. The Lilypad network in its very rawest form, in its most raw form, is not fully private. As in, when you send an input you say you want to run stable diffusion. So you say, okay, create a picture of a polar bear in the desert. That input goes into our network. It gets sent to a GPU. The GPU runs it and sends it back. That whole process is not fully private. So we're talking to teams like Zama, who works on fully homomorphic encryption. We're talking to teams like Clique, who does trusted execution environments. These are privacy mechanisms that we can add as a layered approach, right? So you have your most basic functionality. And then if a customer says, hey, I want something to be 100% private, then we say, okay, pay us more. And we have all these awesome plugins. We have all these awesome integrations that you can use. And it's also cool because it extends the reach of our team, right? Our team is not going to crack fully homomorphic encryption right now. We're very busy with what we're doing. And so why not work with a team that has? And so anyway, in the context of modularity, that's how I think about that.
Yeah, I mean, super helpful, and I think helpful to understand, this word that gets thrown a lot. And let's talk about the alternative, right? So I think it's hard to appreciate modularity until you talk about the alternative, and the evolution of modularity obviously was these pain points and merge. But let's talk about the alternative and kind of the old system.
Yeah. So the original. Well, I don't know if I want to call this the original, but within the last 20 or 30 years, the way that things typically are built, maybe even longer, 40, 50 years, is sort of these monolithic structures, right? So you have a giant, server room at your company, and you build all of these systems on one, or, in one cluster or whatever, and they all kind of just communicate together in such a way. Whereas the sort of the modern version of software development is enabled by cloud, is microservices, right? So, you have an API, basically a connection to a server that runs some sort of process that you can kind of outsource. So a really clear example of this is Stripe. So if I'm a developer and I build a website and I want to take payments, I could build my own payment mechanism, or I just pay Stripe. I don't know, I forget what it is, $20 a month or something, plus a transaction fee. And they have all the code already created. And I just use their code in my web app, and I use their API to just communicate with their servers to then run those payments for me. And so that's how you kind of hear about these indie developers. I think Level SIO is a great case where he's built, I believe, 4 or 5 SaaS products as a single guy, and he's generating somewhere around 200,000, 250,000 of revenue per month. One of them is if you take a picture of a room and it will design the room for you as an interior designer, right? So he built all these with microservices, and he does get flack from people because some people think that that's sort of not a scalable way of building things. And in some cases they're right. But this idea of being able to use all these different microservices from different teams you don't have to reinvent the wheel, is what's pushed software development so far. I mean, Uber, all these guys use microservices. And so in the blockchain world, we're sort of emulating that and taking those philosophies of building things in a modular way, like Legos, and abstracting away stuff, and basically, outsourcing, I guess is the wrong word, but using technology that's been trialed and used and is constantly watched and updated, so that you don't have to raise $100 million to build this product out. you can pay $20 a month to Stripe, and you don't have to worry about payments.
Right. You can focus on your core offering and you can move much faster, which is obviously extremely valuable. And I think like, you mentioned the past 20, 30 years, when you think about the innovation curve, right, it just gets steeper and steeper. And so it's more and more important to anticipate that things could change very quickly and to have a system that basically is adaptable to that, or your entire company could go under, right? And I imagine this is when people started to really pay attention to it, was seeing that if you're not able to be agile, then you're in a lot of trouble. And by providing microservices, you allow other people to be agile while using microservices yourself to be agile.
100%, 100%. And the beauty of a lot of this, at least the tools that we're using and a lot of tools I've been referencing, even though probably not Stripe, is they're open source. So the source code is available for the community and for developers and for businesses to look at and audit and build upon. And so it's really, Linux, of course, is like ubiquitously used by pretty much every enterprise, pretty much every computer that you've accessed through Netflix or whatever, like almost guaranteed is running Linux, which is an open source operating system. And that's sort of like one of the like poster children, or one of the most like exciting and clear examples of how open source software in the long run ends up outperforming closed source software. And so it's the same kind of principles that the blockchain world applies. I think most of the blockchain world is open source. What Lilypad is doing is very much open source. And so it really makes you stronger over time.
Yeah. Well, listen, man, I love it. I love jamming with you. I knew we would go down a couple rabbit holes, but I'm glad that we started, a little, like we got there a little slower than we normally do when we get together, grab coffee. So thanks for being on. If people want to check out Lilypad, what do they do? Where can they go? Give us a little bit of promo there.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's always so much fun. We're both based in Austin. And I think what you guys are doing at Digital Wealth is awesome. You talk about abstracting away complexity from users. You're also abstracting away complexity from investors, right? You de-risk investing in the industry. And so I think what you're doing is awesome. So lilypad.tech is the website. Go check it out. Jump into our Discord. You can get it on the website there. And check out our blog. I write a lot of our company blogs, talking about what engineering is up to, what the community is up to. And if you want, come run a node. If you got a GPU sitting around, you want to monetize it, we're in our incentivized testnet right now. So we are not at mainnet. We're targeting end of Q1 of next year for mainnet launch. But yeah, the community we've got is like incredibly technical. And so it's really amazing to just be a part of. So just, come dive in.
Awesome. Hey, listen, thanks for being on, Alex. Talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. It was super fun.